Okay, here we are. A verdict has been reached, so I can now say this is officially our final podcast on the Karen Reed retrial
It
with Katherine
is.
Loftus. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So it's a little after 9 p.m. on Wednesday, June 18th, the day that the jury did reach a verdict in Karen Reed's retrial. The jury came back with not guilty on everything except for OUI. So Karen Reed has been convicted only of a drunk driving charge and already sentenced to 1 year probation. Um, your reaction when that verdict came in?
I was surprised it was just the OUI. And I only say that because they took so long from the time that they sent the questions to the judge, which genuinely indicated that that's where they were on the OUI. They asked about the timeline of the OUI. Could they evaluate Karen Reed's statements in the videos taken of her, as well as whether they could decide on one and whether that would mean it was guilty of everything. And they used the OUI as the example. And so my initial indication yesterday was that, okay, they're focusing on the OUI. Now they have clarification from the questions. We'll probably get a verdict on the OUI in the next, hour or two. And then we had the entire day yesterday. We had the entire day today. I mean, really almost the full day before they came back with the verdict, sort of did, sort of didn't. And then ultimately, when they returned the verdict, it was the single OUI. So it certainly, I think, was surprising in that for it to take 4 days to come to a conclusion on just the OUI makes me think that there was more back and forth about maybe some of the other charges, and they just couldn't get the entire jury to some, and then ultimately settled, where everybody could agree, which was on the single operating under the influence. So it's interesting outcome. It's not one that I expected. But that's the way our system works. The case was presented by Hank Brennan. I think he did an excellent job presenting. I think the defense did an excellent job in defending, both persuasive closing arguments. And, the jury has spoken. That's a decision.
Let's talk a little bit about that verdict, no verdict moment. So basically, what happens is shortly after lunch, everybody's called back, and the judge tells them that during the lunch break, the jury knocked on the door and told the court that it had a verdict. And then before she could even summons everybody to court, the jury knocked again and said, like, just kidding, we don't have a verdict.
Right.
Basically, changed their minds. And so, just out of safety, she asked them to hand in an envelope the verdict slips they had filled out. And she said she didn't look at them. Nobody was to look at them, but they were just like marked in case they
For the
were
court file.
right. And then minutes later, there was an actual verdict. Like that all
Right.
happened in 30 minutes total. How
Right.
strange was that?
It's very strange. I've never seen anything like it. I've never even heard of anything like that happening where, they get all the way to the point of notifying the court officer and, handing in a jury verdict form. And then, it almost it makes you feel like they voted, they came to a conclusion, they filled it out, and then someone had sort of this like last minute sort of gut reaction change, like, wait, am
Oh,
I making
yeah.
the right decision? Which way am I going? And we don't know, maybe we'll hear at some point from the jurors about what that was, but it's very unusual. Although maybe not in this case because everything is unusual in the Commonwealth versus Karen Reed. But it was interesting, and I'm not even sure that, I imagine that they'll keep those original verdict forms probably sealed. I don't know that anybody will ever open them
Or know what
and
to
stay.
say. Yeah.
Right, and just stay with the court record, but it was definitely an unexpected information to hear from the judge.
Okay, and you talked about kind of the lawyering in this case earlier. You have said to me numerous times that, in your opinion, focusing more on reasonable doubt and more on the substandard police investigation was the defense's more clear path to an acquittal. You were right, clearly. Do you think that's what did it?
I do, I do. I think that, I've been thinking a lot about that. Good lawyering prompts more good lawyering. And you had, I mean, I think the first time, Adam Lally is a good attorney. He maybe was a bit outmatched in, style and sort of the expertise that the defense team had. But what happened in trial number one was we heard all about this third party argument. It really felt like they were trying to prove Karen Reed's innocence versus getting her off of the charges, that she had before her. And ultimately, there was a mistrial, which is considered in some ways a win, but we knew that the jury was 9-3 ultimately on the manslaughter. This time around, I think that in the beginning of the case, they maybe started to go towards third party, but Hank Brennan, in some ways, presented such an efficient case in it excluding any of the third party witnesses, any of the third party really testimony or evidence that came in the first way, that the defense, I don't know if it was purposeful or intentional before trial, whether this was their strategy, but they definitely seemed to me towards, the middle and then the end of the case to shift away from, the Jen McCabe, to shift away from the real is trying to prove that something else actually happened and focusing on you might think she's guilty, but the Commonwealth has not proven that case, and we've poked enough holes. So, and I think that based on the problems in the investigation, Michael Proctor being fired, things with Canton PD not pulling the ring video, maybe interviewing Brian Higgins or exploring that a little bit more, the conflicts of interest. There were so many things that were beneficial to a defense argument and really makes, I think, the more persuasive argument to a jury is to say, you have a legal responsibility to hold the Commonwealth to their burden. And you might think she's guilty or you might be swaying that way, but look at all these things that I think make it that you can't find beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you must find her not guilty, which I think is a much more persuasive argument than trying to convince the jury that this entire different theory happened with all of these sort of co-conspirators. So maybe they heard me and took my advice.
Okay, so you said this, nothing in this case has been usual. Yes, this we know. Let's talk about the scene outside the courthouse. I know you were on with WBZ when it was happening, but I've never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, there must have been 1,000+ people there, barricades in the street shut off. The cheering was so loud that we couldn't hear the rest of the verdict being read in court because the cheering was so
Wow.
loud it was coming through the courthouse walls. Um, and then Karen Reed out and making the statement, she said thank you to her supporters, and then also that nobody has fought harder for justice for John O'Keefe than she has. Just like reflect on all of that.
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of reflective of how much support she has, not only, from her team, from her family, but really in the community in Massachusetts. People, we've heard that people have come from different places, flown in, and they really, believe in her cause. And it's very unusual. This is not, the normal kind of case. And even when we see cases that do garner a lot of publicity, it's oftentimes that people are more interested in sort of the case itself as opposed to, really kind of connecting with the defendant. And in this case, people are very attached to Karen Reed herself. And so I think her supporters really saw this as, a huge win for her, success for the defense team, and almost it feels like they feel a personal victory, not just for her, but in some ways for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier, my coworkers and I, that like other cases where you see this kind of reaction, it's because the defendant is a celebrity already, like
That's
O.J.
right.
Simpson.
That's right.
Karen Reed became a celebrity through this murder trial.
Yeah, so it's very different. I mean, I'm not sure that there is anyone you could compare this case to that's, like you said, not a celebrity. We see Johnny Depp, we see OJ, we see, there's a lot of criminal cases, and, the worlds we live in now, people love true crime. It's, its own genre, and people watching from home in different, spaces, but it, it's, it's unlike anything I've ever seen.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the prosecution. Uh, how big of a loss is this for, I'm not talking about the O'Keefe family. Of course, it's a huge loss for them, and we'll talk about them in a minute, but the lawyers, DA Michael Morrissey, Special Prosecutor Hank Brennan, Adam Lally. How big of a loss is this?
I mean, it is a big loss because, when you are a prosecutor, feel you feel like it's your job to, fix what sort of wrong has been, done upon a victim and a victim's family. And so the DA's office feels an obligation to get justice for John O'Keefe's family, and they believe that justice would be Karen Reed being found guilty. And so anytime you have a loss in a case where you feel very strongly in who you believe the culprit is, it's difficult. And on top of it, there has been a tremendous amount of time and effort expended on this case, hours and hours and hours. Clearly, the level of preparation that went into, both trial number one and trial number two. It's certainly disappointing as, the lawyer who's trying the case. Anytime you have a big case and you don't come out on the winning side, it's tough emotionally. It's tough. You need a little bit of decompressing from it, but I don't think we've heard, you correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've heard from anyone in the DA's office. I likely wouldn't expect to hear from Hank Brennan because technically, he's a special prosecutor. He doesn't represent the Commonwealth in that kind of, public relations way. I am surprised that we haven't heard from DA Morrissey because I think, generally we do as to, what they think, what their feelings are. But it's certainly a loss for the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and I have to point out at this point, because we get a lot of criticism for this in the media, I have reached out numerous times to the DA's office for interviews, for statements, you name it. And no, nothing today. And it is every murder case I've covered, usually regardless of the outcome, the DA will show up at least and usually make
Yes.
media statement.
That's right. And generally because you remember the DA is an elected position. So, they play the role of, chief law enforcement agents for that county, but they also really serve a political role as well. And what we usually see, or what I would have expected to see is, Michael Morrissey to come out and, make a statement along the lines of, we believe that the Commonwealth believes fully that Karen Reed was responsible for this. We, tried our very best to put on the strongest case. But ultimately, we respect, the jury system, and they heard all the evidence and they came to a different conclusion than we did. But, something along those lines. So it's a little disappointing that we don't hear anything because it makes it feel a little bit like, sore loserish. I think the family and, the citizens of the Commonwealth in Norfolk County are entitled to at least hear from the opposing party. And it doesn't have to be some, big thing, but I think an acknowledgement is warranted.
Right, let's get into our final topic, which is that the legal fights are not all the way over. The O'Keefe family still has a civil suit, a wrongful death suit against Karen Reed. Can you just explain for our viewers how the legal standard is different than it is in this trial? And if you have any thoughts on what their chances are of succeeding?
I think they probably have a higher chance of success in civil court. It's similar but different. Many of the rules of evidence are the same, but the standard is the preponderance of evidence, which basically means more likely than not. So the jury or a judge would have to find that Karen Reed is more likely than not responsible for John O'Keefe's death, and how they do that is quite literally, 51%, 49%. If you just get over the threshold of 50%, you make it in terms of civil culpability. And that's very different than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And we do that, the standards are so different because in civil court, we're largely dealing with monetary damages. So if she's found liable, there will be a judgment, a financial judgment against her. Whereas in criminal court, obviously your life and liberty is at stake. And so the burden is significantly higher to find somebody guilty of something than it is to find them liable. So I think they probably have a fairly strong chance at success in civil court. Because we also know there's going to be, there will be depositions. I mean, she'll be subject to a deposition, especially because the charges, the case has been resolved with not guilties. There'll be a lot of discovery. Likely, we'll see some of the statements that she was making in these various media outlets. So I think we'll see sort of the more secondary consequences of, some of the decisions and whether they're ultimately successful or not.
Thank you. My computer froze at one point there. Hopefully we got your whole answer, but if anything looks glitchy, it's because my computer froze. So,
Okay.
thank you for your time and your time
Thank
in
you.
general helping us with this case. It's been so complicated and we appreciate your help breaking it all down.
I Thanks for having me. And
All right.
we're all ready for a nap.
Yes. Yes. Good night. And
Yeah.
we'll talk soon, but not that soon.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
All
Bye.
right. Thanks.